everyone, my name's Shireen. Thanks for tuning in. I've been kindly asked by the Adjudication Core of Humanities Debate Open 2025 to do a workshop on how to adjudicate principles. And spoiler alert, it's not too different from judging any other argument, but hopefully this will help clear up some confusion or maybe misconceptions about how to assess principles in debate. As a general disclaimer for the workshop will assume you know the basics of British parliamentary judging. So it obviously applies for Asian parliamentary as well, given you have principal arguments in both formats, but we'll use examples in British parliamentary. So it assumes you've judged a little bit, you kind of know what's going on in British parliamentary. It also assumes you know the fundamentals of principal arguments, like basic mechanisms, basic types of principles, and what headlines they would fall under, and that you know principled arguments are not automatically any stronger or weaker than consequentialist or practical arguments. It'll depend on the strength and the veracity of those arguments made in the debate. The workshop will primarily focus on how to assess the strength of principles in relation to one another, either as a judge or as a speaker. And if you're looking for more in-depth resources on how to construct principles or the actual proofs behind principles, I would recommend the listed workshops here for a sort of matter file on how those principal arguments could be proven well in a debate. As a general overview of what we'll cover, we'll first look at the basics of principled reasoning, and then look at how to assess the strength of a principal argument, and lastly, how to weigh a principle versus a practical, and vice versa. So the general pillars of how to assess a principal argument are the exact same as a practical argument, because at the end of the day, they're both arguments. So the types of questions you would ask yourself as a judge or even as a speaker when you're constructing the argument are broadly the same. Did the speaker provide reasons, such as intuition pumps or explanations, for why the principle is true? And do those reasons make sense? A laundry list of reasons that don't make sense will not be able to prove a practical impact or a principled argument, and it's therefore more about the quality or the actual logic of the reasons given, as opposed to the number or the persuasive sounding language surrounding the reasons given. Are the reasons sufficient to meet the burden of proving the principle? In the same way that assertions and one-liners are insufficient to prove a practical outcome, they're probably insufficient to prove a principled argument as well. And therefore, again, it's more about the holistic assessment of the argument as opposed to individual lists of reasons, etc. What counts as a reason for a principle? Because a principal argument isn't rooted in a practical outcome or sort of practical conditions in the same way a consequentialist argument is, the types of reasons you would hear to prove a principle are a bit different. So as opposed to structural mechanisms, you could hear things like intuition pumps or thought experiments or just analogies, or general examples to prove why a principle is true in majority of instances. The first thing that could come up here is the explanation of the principle itself. So for example, when you say we principally support colonial reparations because ex-colonizers benefited through the exploitation of ex-colonies, that's just explaining sort of definition or origin of that principle in order to make it clear to the rest of the people in the round. In the same way you would have to make clear the argument you're making if it was a practical outcome. You would also hear things like intuition pumps and thought experiments. Most commonly, you would hear like the trolley problem, the victimless crime, the happiness machine, and maybe other sort of novel or original thought experiments that are just put out in the speech to appeal to either the judge's intuition or just to sort of set the tone for why the principle is true, given the conditions of the thought experiment and the outcome of that. The last thing you could hear is intrinsic importance or value for that principle. So for instance, utilitarianism maximizes total net good, assuming imperfect information, and is therefore a more objective moral framework. The intrinsic value here is the fact that it's more objective as a moral framework because it does not cast judgment on the lives or the quality of information you have, i.e., it doesn't matter if it's a rich or a poor person, that both people and their lives are treated equally, which is why it's more objective as a utilitarian metric to assess the number of lives as opposed to the quality of lives you're trying to save. In contrast, or as another example, democracy is the fairest form of governance because no citizen could choose the country they were born in as a result of the birth lottery. The intrinsic value of democracy as a principle here is its fairness in equalizing all people given the birth lottery, i.e., because people could not choose the conditions or country or government they were born into, the fairest thing to do is just equalize everyone's opinions so that no one group of people has a stronger opinion for how the country is run than another, and that's fair. And that is the intrinsic value of democracy as a principle. So in the same way, you would need to know facts about international relations to debate well in an international relations motion. you would probably need to know some things about principles in order to debate well in a principled argument or principled motion. It's not necessarily something that you can come up with on the spot if you're unfamiliar with, and therefore you should probably do a bit of reading or matter filing if you're unfamiliar with how to construct principles. I would recommend the earlier workshops listed if you want to find out how to construct these principles or what mechanisms, intuition pumps, etc., you can use to prove them more rigorously in a debate. But generally, you should as well read up on principles if you know they're either a weaker point of yours or you're not necessarily sure how to execute them well in a particular debate. How do you weigh or assess the strength of a principled argument? So these are going to be things that you can beef up a principled argument with, either as a speaker or as a judge, things you would look out for in an argument presented by a speaker to explain why the principle is compelling. The first thing is considerations of symptomatic harm. So in the same way, a practical argument often comes at its expense or often comes at another harm, like an opportunity cost or the marginalization of one group of people for another group of people, principles sometimes can also have their own symptomatic harms. So for example, with the colonial reparation principle, the principle still stands despite it meaning ex-colonizer countries will lose money. So the symptomatic harm here is ex-colonizer countries losing money, and the overall discussion of the principle is that it still stands even though it comes at that harm. So the way the team would justify it obviously depends, and I've not included here for brevity, but it should at least tell you that the team is considering the harms associated with the principle, but even then why the principle outweighs or overcomes those harms to still stand above it in the round. The second form of consideration are possible exceptions. So on the democracy principle, the exception here could be, well, what if the democracy or the democratic government isn't effective? What if it's inefficient and corrupt, etc.? And the response to that exception is it doesn't necessarily matter because we're not discussing the perfect standard or idealized version of the government. We're discussing the fairest form of government, which again, given the birth lottery and everything we've just explained, is still democracy because it ensures an equalized playing field for all citizens and also ensures maximum preference aggregation, which is just that now every person in the country can express who they want to run the government, and the majority vote is a representation of the people's will, so to speak, and therefore is a fair way to determine who runs the country. Again, the exception here is, well, what if it's a bad government? The response is, it doesn't matter if it's good or bad per se, because it is still a representation of the people's will, and therefore is still a principle that comes above that exception. So these two things are, as a speaker, considerations you would include to make your principle more compelling, because you're considering the sort of surrounding circumstances or conditions that might affect your principle. And to a judge, if a team is able to successfully sort of address these considerations, it should also tell you that the principle is quite well proven and robust because it's considered those circumstances and external conditions in its proof. The second type of sort of additional reason you can give to bulk up or beef up your principle is either proof of its universal application or proof of its specific application. So if something is universal, it can't be specific and vice versa. So whether a principle is universal or not depends on obviously the type of principle and the way you are using it in your strategy or in your case in the particular debate. So as a judge, you should not necessarily look for both in a particular principled argument. You should just sort of look out for which direction the team is going for and whether they've proven that particular direction. So if a team wants to prove the principle as universal, you look out for those reasons. If they want to prove it as specific, you look out for those reasons. And if you're a speaker, you would do the same in terms of choosing one strategy over the other. So as an example of universal application, state preservation of autonomy is a universal principle, regardless of whether the individual is poor, rich, the oppressed, or the oppressor, because if one person's autonomy can be eroded by the state, anyone's autonomy can be eroded by the state as well. What that means is it doesn't matter what type of individual we're discussing. It just matters that they are individuals under a state, and the state should preserve everyone's autonomy regardless of what type of life they're living, what type of person they are, etc. And therefore, it is a universal moral norm or principled standard we ought to adhere to because it's just something good. So the something good obviously is the additional explanations as to why, but generally speaking, the aim of this particular consideration is to explain why the principle is universal. In contrast, specific applications mean the principle only apply in particular circumstances. And if you're trying to be strategic with it, you're trying to prove that this is the circumstance in your debate or your case where the principle only applies. So for example, violence against others is a general harm, but in the case of self-defense specifically, a person is justified in using violence when all other options have been exhausted and they are an immediate threat of danger or harm to themselves. So the team or the speaker in this example is acknowledging that violence in general is a harm, but specifically as a last resort in self-defense, it is a principally justifiable tool to use if it means self-preservation, self-defense against immediate threats of danger or harm to themselves. So again, as a judge, you would acknowledge that the speaker is sort of considering the fact that the particular principle could be undermined by the fact that violence is a harm, but particularly in the instance of self-defense, that's where the principle is justifiable, and you should consider that as additional reasons as to why it is a beefed up principle, so to speak. These are also all reasons another team could respond to a principle, or a closing team could extend off of a principle in their opening. Because again, they're all reasons as to why a principle argument is strong. So if they are lacking or absent in a principled proof, then a opposition team could sort of use those as vulnerable points to respond to, or a closing team could latch onto those as areas they could have a vertical extension from. We'll look at a few examples to maybe get a bit of a hang of what it sort of looks like. And the first example of this house would ban cigarettes. OO says autonomy should always be preserved. Therefore, we support the right of people to smoke if they want to choose to do so. We should not ban cigarettes. But OG responds, you can make bad choices. The point at which your autonomous choice harms yourself, in this case, smoking harms your health, we should remove the choice entirely. We should ban cigarettes. So OG is responding to OO here by explaining how there is an exception to the rule. There is an exception to autonomy as a principle if it means your autonomous choice is harming yourself, and that should be assessed as a valid response against opening opposition. Again, this is sort of a out of context vacuum exchange I'm using for the sake of example. Whether this automatically defeats OO from OG, I can't say, because it will depend on the other maybe 13 minutes of speeches in both OG and OO in the debate that you should assess holistically, as I'll mention again later on. Example number 2, this house would give more votes to the poor. OO says no one chose the circumstances they were born in because of the birth lottery, so we ought not arbitrate the value of an individual's vote according to those circumstances. What that means is just because someone was born poor, they should not be given more votes just because they were born poor. But CG responds, if OO agrees the rich did not choose to be born rich, the poor did not choose to be born poor, they could not choose either circumstance, which means we should adjust circumstance to accommodate for the clear differences in quality of life. So CG is responding to OO by proving that the principal claim is not specific to just one group of people, i.e., OO says one group of people did not choose to be born in their circumstance, we should sort of care about them a bit more and not harm them. But CG says, no, the birth lottery applies universally, and therefore it also helps our side of the house in kind. So they're sort of weaponizing the fact that OO made a concession towards the principle being existent for all groups of people in that particular regard. Last example in terms of how you could extend with the principle argument. Let's say OG says violent resistance is justified as a form of self-defense against the state that has failed them systemically. And they also successfully prove how the state has failed them, for example, through socioeconomic disparities. OO responds, in most cases, the harms caused by the state are not severe enough to warrant the harms caused by violent resistance, meaning that they're trying to claim here that just because the state caused socioeconomic disparity, that does not justify violent riots, vandalism, etc. So the question at the end of the OG-OO exchange is, what exactly qualifies violence, or what justifies the use of violence in these particular instances? So CG extends, violent resistance is a form of self-preservation against the state, not just self-defense, which is a more universal standard than what OG says. So if proven well, CG would have proven why violence is an acceptable form of resistance against the state, which fulfills OG's principal burden to a higher degree. So what happens here is if CG can explain violence itself being justified as a means to preserve your general being, even if not in self-defense, or even if not at the sort of last resort type of harm that OO is suggesting, they can take it over OG if they're able to prove that, again, violence is justified, even if the amount of harm caused by the state is not as much against the minority. And that's how you could sort of strategize your closing case to extend a principle off of your opening if you're able to find that gap or that particular sort of avenue to enter the debate in. Lastly then, how do you weigh principled versus practical arguments? There's a few things that you can consider, but I would say, again, as a general rule of thumb, the way you would weigh these two arguments is the same as how you would weigh two practical outcomes as well. You would ask yourself, is one more well-proven than the other? Does one have more associated weighing with it in the debate themselves? Does the team provide weighing for those arguments in relation to the other team, etc.? So in terms of how you would use those same pillars to judge a practical versus a principle, you would generally go about it the same way, just ask yourself slightly different questions. So for instance, in depth of analysis, is the principle more well proven than the practical or vice versa? Do the teams provide compelling characterization, mechanisms, reasons, respectively, etc.? Do they provide sufficient engagement and responses towards each other to undermine those arguments in either side of the house, etc.? In the same way, again, you would assess a practical clash between two teams. Weighing for the principle. Does the team themselves explain why the principle should be independent of its practical outcome? So why democratic elections are always important, even if it results in an incompetent candidate becoming president, why that's still something you ought to care about over the practical manifestation of that principle. And lastly, on the other side, weighing for the practical. Does the other team explain why the practical outcome is so much more impactful than the consideration of a principle? So it does actually matter if you happen to elect an incompetent president. It causes a lot of harm to a lot of people, and therefore that should be more important than a sentimental democratic principle, for example. So again, in the same way you would assess two practical impacts in terms of rigor and weighing, etc., you would do the same for principle versus practicals in a debate as well. The last thing I would suggest or point out in terms of how you would weigh principle versus practicals is whether teams make implicit or explicit concessions to the principle itself being an important metric. So we'll look at examples just so it's a bit easier as I go along. In the first example of this house would allow the buy and sale of votes, OG argues it is not immoral to opt out of democracy by choosing to sell your vote for financial reasons. OO argues it is immoral to opt out of democracy through buying and selling of votes, as it concentrates voting power in one group over the other. Because obviously, if the rich are the ones buying votes from the poor, it concentrates political power in the rich. CG explains how both OG and OO rely on the principle of agency. So OG requires unconditional agency to qualify opting out of democracy, i.e., you have unconditional choice to opt out of democracy if you want to, no matter what. But at the same time, OO requires unconditional agency to qualify why concentrating voting power in one group or another is a harm, i.e., it's a harm for only the rich to have more votes or more political power than the poor, because that undermines the agency of the poor. So OO also is relying on a principle of agency to sort of stand their claim. So if CG can prove that unconditional agency exists, is important, and only exists on CG or on government bench, they could take it over their opening half, because they are fulfilling the principal burden that both teams in opening agree is important implicitly or explicitly. That's again a bit sort of that again sort of requires you to be able to identify the groundwork principles that both teams in opening rely on, and then co-opt them into your own case. Or if it's Asian parliamentary, to see how the other team perhaps is conceding to your principal metric, and then use that in weaponization against them when you're resolving clashes, etc. Second example, DLO POI's DPM. Would it be wrong for someone to steal another's toenails without their knowledge or permission? And DPM says, yes, that's wrong. Whether they know it or not, DPM has effectively conceded to DLO's principle, which the DLO could later weaponize against them in their speech or in response against them. So it's very important as a speaker, particularly, to be aware of whether your practical arguments or overall case relies on a groundwork principle or a fundamental principle that the other team could use against you later on in response, etc. Similarly, as a judge, you ought to be a bit aware of these particular relationships, i.e., if a team is making a practical argument that is reliant on a groundwork principle that another team proves, you should use that to assess whether this team is making concession to the other team in that particular exchange. No, weighing principles and practicals are not linear. You'll probably need to consider underlying framing or overall round weighing, etc., when assessing these exchanges, in the same way that you are expected to judge holistically in general. So these examples I've given you so far are sort of just for the purpose of showing how those exchanges might manifest, but are not automatically reasons why one team wins or why one side of the principles argument is better than the other, etc. They are to be taken holistically in a debate itself, and not just sort of linear, out of context vacuum statements against each other. An example of holistic assessment is as such. Sometimes principles are not distinct arguments, meaning it's quite rare for you to find, well, not quite rare, but it's not always you'll hear distinct principle arguments being made in the round, i.e., you'll not always have teams saying, First argument is the principle of autonomy. Obviously, those apply in some debates, but some debates also just have purely practical considerations as well. But even in those debates, there is a chance that those practical considerations rely on principled ideas as a groundwork. For example, OG says we protect the vulnerable, OO says we protect more people. Both are pretty good practical impacts, but the priority of one over another relies on you buying the groundwork principle of the debate. So if OG proves that the lives of the few matter more than the lives of the many, then you're buying into that principle that the lives of the vulnerable matter more than the lives of the majority of the people, and therefore that's the principal groundwork you believe. But if OO proves that the lives of many will outweigh the lives of the few, that's the utilitarian principle that you believe should be the groundwork or metric of the debate, and therefore buy that impact higher over OG. So here, the principal arguments are used as pieces of weighing as opposed to distinct arguments. OG is not arguing for a principle of prioritizing the vulnerable per se, but they're explaining why morally we ought to prioritize the vulnerable as weighing against OO. Similarly, OO is not arguing for like the principle of utilitarianism in abstract. They are saying that utilitarianism is a better metric to assess the impacts in opening half because the lives of the many outweigh the lives of the few for whatever reason. That's the end of the workshop. I hope it's rather clear. Just as a final reminder, the fact that principle and practical arguments are distinct in reasoning does not mean they are distinct as arguments. So again, the guiding principles or pillars, I should say, of what you ask yourself when you're assessing these arguments in a debate should not change. You are still assessing things like rigor, things like whether they are responsive against the other team, whether they are strategic in the positioning of the round, etc., when you're assessing the overall quality. Other than that, I hope I've helped. Thank you very much.